Welcome to the Deep Dive. We sift through fascinating sources, trying to pull out the really important nuggets of knowledge, just helping you get truly well-informed.
That's the goal.
So today, we're plunging into something, well, it feels both profound and actually surprisingly subtle. It's about a significant shift happening in American civic life. Our source material for this deep dive is this really intriguing document. It's called The End of Shame as Policy.pdf.
Right.
And it explores, quote, self-respect, cultural rewilding, and the quiet collapse of the guilt economy.
It's quite a title.
It is. So our mission today is really to unpack this. What is this shame-based governance? Why might it be losing its grip? And, what's emerging instead? These new forms of engagement, self-expression.
Yeah, and I think it's crucial to frame this right off the bat. The source describes this not just as like an ideological thing.
Okay.
It calls it a material shift, which means, it's visibly impacting how people actually live.
Yeah.
Well, it's subtle. It's slow. And this is key. It's mostly unfunded, so no big organizations are driving it.
Okay. Grassroots almost.
Sort of, yeah. But its impact, it's already showing up in things like migration patterns, how people buy things, consumer behavior,
Right.
even how people talk about, sensitive topics. You can kind of see it in everyday choices.
That's a great distinction to start with. So, okay, this source talks a lot about shame-based governance and this guilt economy. Let's unpack those terms. What do they actually mean?
Okay. So if you think in political economy terms, guilt for a while functioned almost like a universal currency.
A currency.
Yeah. The idea was if you could make a large chunk of the population feel morally compromised about something.
Like race, gender, climate.
Exactly. Race, gender, climate, faith, what you consume, all of it. Then you could extract concessions.
Concessions like money.
Oh.
Could be money, sure.
Yeah.
But also specific ways of speaking, political power, or just civic deference, like yielding ground.
And the source is clear. This isn't some grand conspiracy theory, right?
Right.
It's just how soft power works. Foucault talked about biopolitics.
Right. Controlling populations subtly.
Precisely. Shaping behavior, thoughts, lives. Not just with force. The source calls it compliance manufacturing. It's a sophisticated way of getting people to align.
Okay, that makes sense. So this whole system then, the source says it rested on two core beliefs. One, that guilt actually leads to progress.
Right.
And two, that you could keep this feeling of guilt going, like, sustainably. So why is that breaking down now? What happened?
Yeah, that's a million-dollar question, isn't it? The source basically argues the guilt economy is hitting inflation and fatigue.
Inflation and fatigue, like a real economy.
Kinda, yeah. The returns are diminishing. You put in the guilt, you don't get the same compliance out.
And are there specific signs of this?
Definitely. The source points to things we see all around us, increasing resistance to, language policing, a growing distrust in things like DEI programs, even from people you might expect to support them.
Right.
And just this general palpable fatigue with identity-first discourse, even among groups that were traditionally sympathetic.
I think people feel that exhaustion.
Exactly. It's not just abstract. It's that feeling of walking on eggshells, the sense that the old rules just aren't working anymore, aren't leading anywhere good.
Yeah.
And the source really emphasizes this. This isn't, quote, the backlash of bigotry.
That's important.
Very. It's framed as the exhaustion of a class-wide coping mechanism that no longer feels like it works. People are just tired of performing it.
That resonates. So, okay, when systems fail, this sociologist, Albert Hirschman, he talked about three responses: exit, voice, or loyalty.
Classic framework.
Yeah. And the source suggests we're seeing a mix, a sort of hybridization of all three in America right now.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting way to look at it. How does the document see each of these playing out?
It breaks it down really well.
Yeah.
So exit first. This is pretty literal. Millions are leaving big cities.
All right, we see those trends.
They're leaving legacy institutions, maybe old jobs, old ways of doing things. They're opting out of what the source calls elite-run media ecosystems.
Checking out of the mainstream narrative.
Exactly. But, and this is crucial, the source says they are not retreating from civic life. They're rerouting around broken infrastructure.
So it's not apathy, it's a detour.
A very deliberate bypass, yes. Finding new routes to engagement because the old ones feel blocked or corrupted.
Okay, interesting. So it's not just dropping out, it's redirecting. What about voice then? How are people finding new ways to speak up?
Well, voice is showing up in the rise of all these alternative networks.
Right.
Independent writers, on platforms like Substack, Podcasts like this one,
Right.
YouTube channels, maybe homesteaders sharing practical skills, local co-ops getting started, what the source labels parallel Americana.
Parallel Americana. I like that.
It captures it, doesn't it? People are building new channels entirely outside the traditional gatekeepers to share ideas and influence.
Okay, exit. Voice. What about loyalty? If it's not directed towards the traditional state or big corporations, where's it going?
Yeah, this is interesting. It's not loyalty to the federal government, generally speaking, or to some corporate mission statement.
No.
No, it's a refocusing or reprioritization on locality, faith, community, and nation, but
Not as big ideas.
exactly, not as abstractions, but as lived geographies. It's about the tangible stuff, your actual neighbors, your town, the community you physically interact with.
The real versus the abstract makes sense.
Yeah.
And one key detail the source really hammers home is that this shift isn't necessarily partisan.
Right. That's critical.
It says, and this is quite a line, the Berkeley vegan and the Wyoming rancher now share more lifestyle beliefs than either shares with the World Economic Forum or the HR department of Google.
Wow. That is a statement.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
It suggests this convergence happening underneath the usual political divides, maybe based on shared values like authenticity, self-reliance, things like that.
A rejection of a certain kind of elite-driven globalism, maybe?
Perhaps. So, if this guilt system is crumbling and these new responses are bubbling up, what's the deeper change in mindset here? Why can't a society just run forever on the idea that its own basic story, its foundational mythos, is toxic?
Well, the source argues that the guilt economy, because it was built on these original sins with no redemption,
No way out, basically.
right, no path to actual forgiveness or moving on, it only really worked as long as people believed it was leading somewhere useful, somewhere productive.
Okay.
But eventually, the argument goes, this constant performative alienation from your own country, it stops feeling like critique and starts feeling like psychological sabotage.
That's a strong phrase.
It is. But imagine if your default setting is constantly apologizing for or distancing yourself from your own culture, your own place, it becomes incredibly draining. It hollows things out.
These people feeling disconnected.
Exactly. And so the source says, out of that exhaustion, a new class of Americans, young and old, is emerging who prefer engagement to alienation.
And this isn't just wishful thinking.
No, the source is careful to say it's not naive optimism. It's described as earned affection.
Earned affection, meaning?
A belief that, you can critique a place and still love it.
Okay.
That you can inherit imperfection without burning the house down. It feels, more mature, more resilient, like finding a way back to a kind of civic pride that isn't blind but isn't self-hating either.
A constructive patriotism, maybe?
Perhaps. And you see little signs of this, according to the source. Things that seem minor but are symbolic.
Like what?
Like American flags reappearing on porches, maybe without the heavy irony they carried for a while. Gospel music popping up in unexpected places, like Brooklyn cafes. The rise of trad aesthetics, even among some, disaffected progressives. A sort of search for roots.
Interesting.
Even corporate marketing is catching on, shifting from cynicism to earnestness, from globalist polish to regional authenticity. They're trying to tap into this rediscovered localism and sincerity.
So, tiny cultural indicators of a bigger mood shift.
That's the idea. Subtle, but pointing towards something changing.
Which brings us to this really interesting pivot in the source. Looking at the body as a kind of barometer for the civilizational mood. How does it connect our physical selves to this bigger shift?
Yeah, it's a fascinating connection. Take Ozempic, for example. Obviously, it started as a medical treatment.
Right, for diabetes.
But its cultural significance now. The source calls it symbolic, a controlled burn of fatalism.
Wow. Explain that.
Well, it's not just about losing weight. It's seen as individuals taking back some control, some agency over their health in a world that feels increasingly chaotic and, unmanageable.
Like pushing back against a feeling of helplessness.
Exactly. A refusal to just accept a sort of predetermined, unhealthy fate dictated by modern life or whatever. It's an act of reclaiming agency.
And it's not just Ozempic, right? The source lists other things?
Yeah, a whole cluster of things. TRT clinics becoming more common. Cold plunge tubs everywhere, it seems. People hiking the Appalachian Trail, getting really into sourdough starters, raising backyard chickens.
Things that feel very hands-on, embodied.
Precisely. The source argues these are not just hobbies. They're expressions of this deeper shift towards self-reliance and maybe sovereignty.
Sovereignty over the self.
That's the core idea. When people reassert control over their own bodies, what they eat, how they move, their biology even, they're making a deeper claim. I am still sovereign here.
My body, myself, is still mine to govern.
Yes, it's a fundamental assertion of personal agency, and the source draws a powerful conclusion from this.
Which is?
The moment Shanks loses its grip on the physical self, it's only a matter of time before it loses its grip on the national psyche.
So the personal becomes political, or maybe cultural in this sense. Control the body, reclaim the mind.
Something like that. It suggests the foundation of shame-based control is eroding from the ground up, starting with the individual.
Okay, this leads us straight into the idea of managerial panic. The source has this really provocative line.
Which one?
It says the American managerial class is not panicking because the population is getting angrier. It's panicking because the population is getting less angry in the wrong direction.
Oof. Yeah, that's quite the claim.
What does that mean for a post-shame America if people aren't responding to the old triggers?
Well, it means a post-shame America is, frankly, harder to steer, much harder.
How so?
This population, the one emerging, it doesn't outsource its conscience to HR. That's a great line.
Yes.
It doesn't ask permission to sing, dance, grill, worship, or work out. There's a sense of reclaiming permission, reclaiming joy, maybe?
Without needing elite approval.
Exactly. It remembers how to love its land, its rituals, its eccentricities, even its mistakes without elite narration. It's less reactive, less easily manipulated by guilt narratives, more self-directed.
And maybe the most threatening part for the old guard, the Thor suggests, is that this population, it stops consuming guilt-based content.
Bingo. And if you're part of the, quote, media political industrial class that built a moral empire on pain points,
An empire built on shame and guilt.
then a population tuning out that frequency, refusing that currency, that's an existential threat.
If guilt doesn't buy compliance anymore, the whole model collapses.
Right. The leverage is gone. And the source offers this really thought-provoking wrap-up on it.
Go on.
The future won't be Maggie or woke. It may not even be recognizable.
Something entirely different.
But, it concludes, it will be something harder to market, harder to shame, and harder to control.
Wow. That leaves you with a lot to think about. Harder to market, harder to shame, harder to control. This whole deep dive, it's really been about trying to grasp these subtle, under-the-surface shifts.
It's complex stuff, not obvious headlines mostly.
Yeah, definitely not. And the source ends with this final thought, almost a challenge.
Yeah.
Because when the people stop performing their alienation and start living like the place still matters, then the place starts mattering again.
Living like the place still matters.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How does that idea resonate? What does living like the place still matters actually look like? In your own community, your own life, big ways, small ways.
It's a good question to leave people with. What does that actually mean in practice?
Something to chew on. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Drive.